My name is Hannah Mercer. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been someone people describe with words that sound kind, but are often used to make you easier to overlook. Steady, sensible, low maintenance, grateful. I'm a project manager by trade, the kind of person who remembers the tiny details, keeps everyone calm, and makes sure the wheels keep turning even when nobody notices the strain. I've always had that ability to hold two truths at once. I can be warm without being naive, and quiet without being weak. But if you only meet me at a dinner party, you'd probably assume I'm the one who smiles politely, refills someone's glass, and lets the louder personalities take up the air. For a long time, I let that assumption work in everyone else's favor. It's a story about seeing. It's about what happens when you realize you've been playing a role so well that even you start to forget you're acting. It's about how a marriage can look polished in photos, how it can sparkle under string lights and rehearsed vows, while something essential is quietly eroding behind the scenes. It's about the subtle, repeated moments that don't seem like a big deal individually until they become the entire shape of your life. Over the next hour, I'm going to take you through the emotional journey I didn't talk about while I was living it. The early, easy love, the gradual shift into being the responsible one, the small dismissals that were brushed off as humor, the way I learned to swallow discomfort to keep the peace, and then, without shouting, without theatrics, how I stopped doing that. You'll hear about the vow renewal that everyone praised as romantic and inspiring, and what it felt like to stand there smiling while my body was quietly keeping score. You'll hear what changed in me, not because someone suddenly became cruel, but because I finally stopped negotiating with myself about what I was allowed to need. If there's one sentence that sits at the center of this whole story, it's this: appearances can't hold a marriage together. I'm sharing this with honesty, not drama. Not to punish anyone, not to recruit strangers to take sides, just to tell the truth in the calmest voice I can manage, because calm truth is sometimes the most powerful kind. So before I begin, let me ask you gently, have you ever looked at someone's perfect life and wondered what they were forcing themselves not to feel? I was the easy one. That's what people said about me when they thought it was a compliment. Easy to talk to, easy to rely on, easygoing. If a plan changed at the last minute, I adjusted. If someone forgot something important, I filled the gap without pointing it out. I had a talent for smoothing edges, for absorbing friction so others could keep moving comfortably. In my marriage, this made me invaluable and invisible. To friends, we were balanced. That was the word they used. He was charismatic, expressive, and a storyteller. I was the listener, the organizer, the one who remembered birthdays and dietary restrictions and which stories shouldn't be told around which people. At gatherings, he'd speak, and I'd nod. He'd joke, and I'd smile at the right moments. People often told me how lucky I was to have someone so confident, so driven. No one ever asked him how lucky he was. At work events, I was introduced as the one who keeps everything running. At family dinners, I was the one clearing plates before anyone asked. I didn't resent it, at least not consciously. I told myself this was just who I was, capable, adaptable, mature. I told myself love didn't need to be loud to be real. What I didn't notice at first was how consistently my presence was treated as background noise. Decisions were announced to me instead of discussed. Jokes were made at my expense, gently enough that objecting would have seemed humorless. If I disagreed, it was framed as me being stressed or overthinking. And I let it slide every time, because there was always a reasonable explanation. He didn't mean it that way. He was under pressure. He just forgot. And I was good at forgiving, especially when forgiving kept things calm. I became the emotional shock absorber, the one who anticipated needs before they were voiced, the one who adjusted her expectations instead of adjusting the relationship. I told myself that love was about compromise, and that my discomfort was simply the cost of stability. From the outside, we looked strong, organized, grown up. People admired how little we fought. They didn't see that the absence of conflict wasn't peace. It was me doing all the emotional labor quietly, so nothing ever escalated. I learned how to phrase my needs as suggestions, how to laugh when something stung, how to nod even when I felt dismissed. Over time, this became muscle memory. I didn't think of myself as someone being minimized. I thought of myself as someone who was supportive. But something subtle was happening underneath that identity. The more reliable I became, the less I was consulted. The more understanding I was, the more my understanding was expected. I wasn't being mistreated in a way that would alarm anyone else. There were no raised voices, no obvious betrayals, just a steady pattern of me accommodating, adjusting, absorbing. If you had asked me then whether I was unhappy, I would have said no. I would have said we were solid, that we had history, that we had built something together. What I couldn't have articulated yet was this. I was slowly disappearing inside a role that everyone else found very convenient. And the most dangerous part? I was praised for it. The first moment I can point to, I didn't feel important when it happened. That's why it stayed with me. It was small enough to dismiss, ordinary enough to blend into the background of a good life. If I had told anyone about it, I would have sounded petty. If I had confronted it directly, I would have felt dramatic. So instead, I stored it away in that quiet internal place where you keep things you don't yet have language for. It happened at a dinner with friends, one of those comfortable, familiar evenings where everyone already knows the rhythm of each other's stories. We were talking about a project I'd just wrapped up at work. I wasn't bragging. I was explaining it the way you do when someone asks a follow-up question, when they seem genuinely curious. Halfway through my sentence, he interrupted me. Not sharply, not unkindly, just smoothly, like someone stepping in to clarify a point. He laughed and reframed what I was saying, simplifying it, turning it into a joke that landed well with the table. Everyone laughed. The conversation moved on. I smiled too. That was the cut, not the interruption itself. People interrupt each other all the time. It was the way my voice didn't find its way back into the conversation afterward. The way no one noticed that the story had changed shape once it passed through him. The way I felt a brief, surprising flicker of embarrassment, as if I'd overstepped by speaking at all. I told myself I was being sensitive. I reminded myself that he was just trying to help, that he was better at storytelling, that this was how social conversations worked. I nodded along as if that explanation settled something. But later, when we were alone, I felt it again. I mentioned, casually, that I'd wanted to finish my thought. I said it lightly, the way you do when you're trying not to sound accusatory. He looked genuinely surprised, then amused. "Oh," he said, "I didn't think it was a big deal." And that was it. No apology, no curiosity, just a conclusion drawn without me. The conversation ended there, not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to make it heavier than it already felt. That's how these things begin. Not with cruelty, but with dismissal wrapped in normalcy. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. He'd correct small details in my stories. He'd answer questions directed at me. He'd joke about my over-preparing or my need for control, always with a smile, always in a way that made it seem affectionate. Other people laughed. I laughed too. Each time, something in me tightened and then released, like a muscle learning to brace itself. I became more careful with my words. I chose shorter sentences. I waited for openings that never quite came. No one else seemed bothered. That made it harder to trust my own reaction. If everyone else thought it was harmless, maybe it was. Maybe I just needed thicker skin. Maybe this was what long-term relationships looked like. Small adjustments, minor compromises, nothing worth naming as harm. So I didn't name it, but my body did. I started feeling a faint tension before social gatherings, a subtle calculation about what to share and what to keep to myself. I noticed how often I deferred, how quickly I redirected attention away from myself. Not because anyone asked me to, but because it felt easier. The first small cut didn't bleed, it didn't demand attention, it just changed how I moved through the room. And the most unsettling part, everyone else kept telling me how lucky I was, how supportive he was, how well we worked together. I nodded, I smiled, I agreed. And somewhere inside, a quiet part of me took note, carefully, patiently, of the gap between what was seen and what was felt. Once something happens more than once, it stops feeling like an anomaly. It becomes a pattern. And patterns are easier to live with when you explain them away. By the time I noticed how often I was being talked over, corrected, or gently reframed, I had already developed a system for managing my reaction to it. I called it maturity. I told myself that not every irritation needed to be addressed, that long relationships required flexibility. I reminded myself of all the ways he showed up when it mattered, how he was reliable in crises, how he could be generous, how he wasn't trying to hurt me. Intent became my shield against impact. When friends teased me about being the responsible one, I leaned into it. When family members joked that he'd be lost without me, I smiled and took it as a sign of how essential I was. I translated being taken for granted into being needed. It felt safer that way. The dismissals were never overt. They were subtle, wrapped in humor or practicality. If I expressed a concern, he'd respond with logic instead of listening. If I disagreed with a decision he'd already made, he'd explain why it made sense, why my hesitation was unnecessary. "You worry too much," he'd say, not unkindly. "You're reading into it. Let's not turn this into a thing." And I wouldn't, because I had learned that naming discomfort often made me feel like the problem. I'd watch his patience thin, not dramatically, just enough to signal that continuing would be inconvenient. So I adjusted. I softened. I chose my moments carefully, and then chose silence instead. The truth is, I was rewarded for it. When I stayed quiet, things ran smoothly. When I adapted, we were praised as a couple who never fought. People admired how calm I was, how I didn't knee or make drama. I absorbed those compliments like evidence that I was doing something right. I didn't realize how much of myself I was editing out in the process. Over time, my internal monologue changed. I stopped asking, "Why did that bother me?" and started asking, "Is this worth mentioning?" Most of the time, the answer was no. Not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't seem worth the effort it would take to explain myself. I told myself I was choosing peace. But peace that requires one person to keep shrinking isn't peace. It's quite compliant. Still, I wasn't ready to see it that way. I told myself every relationship had asymmetries, that someone always cared more about details, about tone, about emotional undercurrents, that this was just the role I naturally fell into. What I didn't notice was how rarely my role was questioned, how rarely my comfort was considered without my prompting it. How often my adaptability became the default setting, not a gift. There were moments, small, sharp flashes of clarity, when I'd hear my own voice from the outside. I'd catch myself apologizing for bringing something up, or laughing at a joke that made me feel small, or saying it's fine when it very clearly wasn't. Those moments passed quickly. I was busy. Life was full. We were planning things, building things, moving forward. There was always a future milestone to focus on, something that promised renewal, improvement, closeness. I told myself this was just a phase. But phases end when something changes. And nothing was changing, because I was absorbing everything that could have forced it to. The disrespect wasn't loud enough to shock me into action. It was quiet enough to normalize, to make me doubt my own sensitivity, to make me grateful for stability instead of curious about fulfillment. I wasn't being mistreated in a way that would justify leaving, and that, I would later understand, was the point. Because when disrespect wears the mask of normalcy, it doesn't push you away. It teaches you to stay. Roles in relationships are rarely announced. They emerge quietly, shaped by repetition and reinforced by relief. Once everyone knows who does what, no one wants to disturb the arrangement, especially if it works. My role was reliability. I was the one who remembered, the one who adjusted schedules, the one who anticipated emotional fallout before it happened and quietly redirected it. If something went wrong, people looked to me, not because I was in charge, but because I was capable. I carried that identity with a strange sense of pride. Being dependable felt like being indispensable. But indispensability has a shadow. The more I handled, the less anyone checked in. The more I smoothed over, the less anyone noticed the effort. I became the emotional infrastructure, essential, unseen, only acknowledged when something cracked. In our marriage, this role was solidified in subtle ways. Plans were made assuming I'd accommodate. Decisions were finalized before I was looped in. My preferences were treated as flexible, his as fixed. It wasn't malicious, it was efficient. And efficiency is persuasive. If I hesitated, I'd hear the familiar reassurance, "You're better at this stuff." If I pushed back, it was framed as unnecessary friction. I learned quickly which reactions kept things running and which ones slowed everything down. So I chose the ones that kept the machine moving. I became careful not to need too much, careful not to disrupt the rhythm, careful not to be difficult. I told myself that being easy to be with was a virtue, that love didn't require constant affirmation, that I didn't need to be centered to be valued. But something else was happening underneath that logic. The role I was assigned didn't leave room for me to change, or to be uncertain, or to be messy. I was the stable one, the calm one, the one who could be counted on no matter what. When you live inside that role long enough, you start performing it even when no one's watching. I noticed how uncomfortable people became when I expressed doubt or frustration. How quickly conversations shifted back to neutral when I hinted at dissatisfaction. It was as if my discomfort disrupted an unspoken agreement. You're the strong one. Don't make us worry about you. So I stopped. I edited myself, not because anyone demanded it outright, but because the world around me seemed to relax when I did. And there is a powerful incentive in being the person who makes everyone else feel at ease. What I didn't realize was how one-sided that comfort had become. I was carrying the emotional weight of the relationship, but I wasn't shaping it. I was maintaining something that no longer reflected me. The role had replaced the relationship itself. There were moments, quiet, private ones, when I'd look at my life from a distance and feel a strange disconnect. Everything was functioning, nothing was broken, and yet I felt like a supporting character in my own story. Still, I didn't rebel, I didn't confront, I didn't demand change. Because roles are sticky, they come with expectations, and expectations come with consequences. I knew, instinctively, that stepping out of mine would create confusion, discomfort, questions I wasn't ready to answer. So I stayed where I was, reliable, useful, invisible. At least that's what everyone else thought. Because inside, something was beginning to resist the shape I'd been pressed into. Not loudly, not angrily, just enough to make it impossible to keep pretending I fit. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voices, no moment anyone else would point to as a turning point. If you had been watching from the outside, you would have seen an ordinary day unfold exactly as expected. That's why it took me a while to understand that something irreversible had happened. It was a quiet morning. We were preparing for our wedding vow renewal, something he had suggested, something everyone else seemed excited about. A celebration, a recommitment, proof that we were still solid after all these years. I was standing in this kitchen, scrolling through a checklist on my phone, mentally organizing logistics. He walked in and glanced at the list over my shoulder. "You're really overthinking this," he said casually. "It doesn't have to be perfect." It wasn't the words themselves, it was the reflex behind them. The assumption that my care was excessive, my effort was a flaw that needed to be corrected. I nodded, like I always did. I said something agreeable, and then for the first time, I noticed how automatic that response was. How little it reflected what I actually felt. Because what I felt wasn't stress. It was grief. Not the kind that crashes into you, but the kind that settles in your chest when you realize something important has been missing for a long time. I wasn't upset about the event. I was grieving the fact that the person I was doing all this for didn't see the depth of my intention, only the inconvenience of it. Later that day, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I looked composed, calm, capable, exactly the way people expected me to look. And for the first time, I wondered who that composure was for. That question stayed with me. It didn't demand an answer right away. It just hovered, quietly, changing how I experienced everything that followed. At dinner, he talked about the renewal as if it were a performance. Who would be there? How it would look? What people would say. I listened, nodded, and contributed when necessary. But something in me had stepped back. I realized that I had been managing my own disappointment for years, presenting it in ways that were easy for others to accept. I had been editing my reactions so thoroughly that even I had lost access to them. And in that moment, I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. Clear that I couldn't keep translating myself into something smaller, just to maintain an image. Clear that the renewal wasn't about us reconnecting. It was about reinforcing a version of our marriage that was comfortable for everyone else. Clear that I had been complicit in my own erasure. That realization didn't come with a plan. It didn't tell me what to do next. It simply made it impossible to go back to not knowing. From that day on, I started noticing everything. The way my suggestions were acknowledged but rarely followed. The way my silence was interpreted as agreement. The way I was praised for being low drama, as if having needs was a liability. None of this was new. What was new was my refusal to keep explaining it away. I didn't confront him. I didn't announce a change. I didn't demand anything at all. I just stopped lying to myself about what things were costing me. And once you see the price clearly, you either pay it consciously or you stop paying it altogether. That was the day something shifted. Not in our marriage, in me. There's a difference between silence that comes from fear and silence that comes from clarity. I had lived in the first kind for years without calling it that. The second kind arrived quietly, almost gently, and changed everything about how I moved through my days. I didn't announce that I was pulling back. I didn't adopt a new tone or set boundaries out loud. From the outside, I looked the same, calm, cooperative, present. But internally, I stopped offering explanations. When he dismissed an idea, I didn't rush to justify it. When a joke landed at my expense, I didn't smooth it over with a laugh. I let moments end without rescuing them. I let silences stretch just long enough for their shape to be felt. This wasn't punishment, it was an observation. For the first time, I watched how often my effort had been filling space that no one else intended to fill. I noticed how quickly conversations stalled without my emotional scaffolding. How often did decisions default to his preference when I didn't actively redirect them? And I noticed something else. No one asked why I had gone quiet. My silence was interpreted exactly the way my compliance always had been. As agreement, as contentment, as easy. That was the moment I understood how deeply the pattern ran. Silence, when it had served others, was welcomed. When it had served me, it went unnoticed. I started choosing what to engage with and what to let pass. Not because I was conserving energy, but because I was recalibrating my sense of responsibility. I had been taking accountability for everyone's comfort. I stopped doing that. The change was subtle, but its effects weren't. He began to fill the space more, to explain more, to justify decisions that previously went unchallenged because I quietly absorbed them. He didn't see this as a response to my withdrawal. He saw it as me being less involved. "You've been kind of distant," he said one evening, half joking. "I've just been busy," I replied. And that was true, just not in the way he assumed. I was busy paying attention. I was busy noticing how little curiosity there was about my internal world. How rarely I was asked what I wanted, unless it was directly relevant to logistics. How quickly things returned to normal when I didn't push back. And the most revealing part, nothing escalated. There was no panic, no sudden concern, no attempt to reconnect on a deeper level. The system adjusted, my reduced input was absorbed, the machine kept running, just with a little less care for balance. That told me everything I needed to know. Silence had always been my default because it made me easy to live with. Now, it has become a diagnostic tool. It showed me where I had been over-functioning and where my presence had been mistaken for support rather than partnership. I wasn't waiting for him to notice. I wasn't testing him. I wasn't hoping for an apology. I was gathering information, and the information was clear. The marriage functioned best when I asked for the least, when I needed the least, when I disappeared just enough to keep things smooth. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. So I continued, calm, polite, engaged on the surface, quiet underneath. Not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of respect for myself. Because silence, when chosen deliberately, is not absence. It's alignment. And alignment has a way of making the next steps inevitable. What people misunderstand about quiet people is this. When we stop reacting, we don't stop seeing. In fact, we see more. Once I stepped out of my reflex to manage emotions and smooth outcomes, my attention sharpened. I noticed patterns I'd been too busy compensating for before. Not just in him, but in myself. I started documenting things, not in a dramatic way. No hidden files or secret folders, just notes, dates, conversations I wanted to remember accurately. Not to build a case against anyone, but to build clarity for myself. Because memory becomes unreliable when you've spent years minimizing your own experience. I paid attention to how decisions were made. Who initiated them? Who adjusted when things didn't work? I noticed how often my flexibility was assumed and how rarely it was reciprocated. I noticed how we often meant his vision, and how my contributions were framed as support rather than authorship. I also started learning, quietly. I reviewed our finances, not because I suspected betrayal, but because I realized how little I actually owned my understanding of them. I had trusted the system because it had always functioned. I had equated stability with fairness. They are not the same thing. I asked questions, neutral ones, clarifying one. I didn't accuse, I didn't challenge. I listened carefully to how answers were framed. What was emphasized? what was brushed aside as unimportant. No one noticed this shift because it didn't disrupt anything. I was still cooperative, still reasonable, still calm. That's the advantage of being underestimated. When people are used to you carrying weight without acknowledgement, they don't register when you start redistributing it internally. When they believe you're content with very little, they don't imagine you preparing for something else. I also paid attention to my emotional responses. I stopped asking whether something was bad enough to justify discomfort. I started asking whether it aligned with the life I wanted to inhabit long term. That question changes everything. I noticed how often my intuition had been correct in the past. How often I'd felt something was off and talked myself out of it. I began treating those signals not as overreactions, but as data. And the data was consistent. I wasn't angry. I wasn't heartbroken. I was awake. The vow renewal planning continued. People praised how thoughtful I was, how organized, how on top of everything I seemed. No one noticed that I had emotionally stepped back from the symbolism of it all, that I was no longer investing meaning where there was no mutual reflection. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, I stopped negotiating. I didn't need a villain. I didn't need proof of malice. I didn't need a dramatic reveal. I needed alignment between what I gave and what I received. And the more I observed, the clearer it became that the imbalance wasn't temporary, it wasn't situational, it was structural. That's what they never noticed. They didn't notice that my silence had turned into a strategy, that my calm had become deliberate, that my compliance had been replaced by consent, and that consent was now conditional. They didn't notice because they had never learned to look for me unless something was missing. And soon something would be, but not yet. Not until I finished understanding exactly what I was standing on. The reveal didn't arrive with shock. It arrived with confirmation. By the time I found what I was looking for, I already knew, emotionally, that something fundamental was uneven. What I didn't have yet was a definition. And definition matters because it turns vague discomfort into something you can stand on without apologizing. It happened late one evening, long after the house had gone quiet. I was sitting at the dining table, my laptop open, a cup of tea gone cold beside me. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't searching for wrongdoing. I was reviewing documents I had every right to review, financial statements, shared commitments, the practical architecture of a life built together. For years, I had let him be the narrator of our stability. He explained. I trusted. Not because I was incapable, but because it seemed unnecessary to double-check something that appeared solid. That night, I stopped accepting summaries. I read slowly, carefully. I followed threads all the way through instead of stopping when the explanation felt good enough. I noticed how certain assets were framed as shared in conversation, but structured differently on paper. How risks were mutual, but safeguards were not equally distributed. How my contributions, steady, consistent, often invisible, were assumed rather than formally protected. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. Just an imbalance. The kind that hides in plain sight when one person is used to handling logistics and the other is used to trusting the tone of reassurance. The kind that benefits from someone not wanting to seem distrustful by asking too many questions. I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt still. There is a particular calm that arrives when confusion ends, when the question shifts from, am I imagining this, to, now that I know, what am I going to do with it? I closed the laptop and sat there for a long time. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I needed to let the clarity settle without rushing to narrate it into something else. I didn't tell myself a story about villains or intentions. I didn't reach for justification or blame. I just acknowledged reality. The marriage functioned because I gave more, emotionally, practically, adaptively. And the structure of our shared life reflected that assumption. Not out of cruelty, but out of convenience that had never been challenged. That was the private reveal, not a secret that could be weaponized, a truth that could be acted on. And what surprised me most was how little it hurt. I think by then, I had already grieved the idea that being quiet and loyal would naturally be met with equal care. I had already released the fantasy that patience alone creates balance. What remained was agency. I realized I didn't need him to understand this for it to matter. I didn't need permission to respond to information that affected my future. I didn't need to dramatize it to justify change. Clarity is justification enough. Over the next few days, I didn't behave differently. I didn't confront him with documents or questions. I didn't test him with hypotheticals. I watched. I watched how easily he assumed continuity, how confidently he spoke about our future without checking whether I was still aligned with the version he had in mind. How little awareness there was that something essential had shifted, not in circumstances but in me. That's when I understood something crucial. If I acted from emotion, it would be dismissed as a phase. If I acted from anger, it would be framed as conflict. But if I acted from calm, informed certainty, it would be undeniable. So I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid, but because I was choosing my moment with care. There is power in knowing exactly what you know, and not rushing to prove it. And from that moment on, every step I took was grounded in something that couldn't be argued away. Reality. Clarity doesn't tell you what to do. It only removes the excuses for not deciding. Once I understood the structure I was standing in, emotionally, practically, financially, I reached a place that felt strangely quiet. There was no urgency, no panic, just a narrowing of options. Not because I was trapped, but because I was finally honest about what each option would require of me. I could stay exactly as I was. I could continue being the adaptable one, the emotional stabilizer, the person who made things work with minimal friction. I could accept that my needs would always be secondary unless I made them inconvenient, that my value would remain tied to how little I asked for. That option was familiar, comfortable in its own way. It asked nothing new of me, only that I keep paying a cost I had already normalized. I could try to renegotiate. I could present my concerns carefully, with evidence and calm language. I could ask for structural changes, emotional reciprocity, and shared authorship. I could explain how things felt, how they had felt for a long time. But I knew what that path looked like. It would require him to see something he had never needed to see. It would require sustained curiosity, not just reassurance. And it would likely turn into a debate about intention rather than impact, a conversation I had already lived through in smaller forms. That path required hope, and I was no longer willing to build my future on hope alone. The third option was the one that scared me least and demanded the most honesty. I could leave, not dramatically, not impulsively, not in anger, but with full awareness of what I was stepping away from and what I was stepping toward. Not because he was a monster, but because the structure of our marriage required my self-erasure to function smoothly. Once I named that, the decision became less about love and more about integrity. I asked myself a simple question. If nothing changed, could I respect myself 5 years from now? The answer came without hesitation. No, that was the irreversible point. Not the decision itself, but the recognition that staying would require me to keep betraying something essential in myself. And once you see that clearly, you can't unknow it. You can't bargain with it. You can't pretend it's temporary. I didn't decide in a single moment. I let the conclusion settle. I lived with it quietly, testing it against my daily reality. Each time I imagined staying, my body tensed. Each time I imagined leaving, I felt steadier, not happier, but more aligned. Alignment matters more than comfort. I didn't owe anyone an explanation yet. I didn't owe anyone reassurance. I owed myself coherence between what I knew and how I acted. So I chose the irreversible option, not because it was easy, but because it was clean. Clean in its logic, clean in its ethics, clean in the way it honored truth without needing to dramatize it. I wasn't running away. I was stepping towards a life where my presence wouldn't be conditional on my silence. Once that decision was made internally, everything else became implementation. And implementation, unlike emotion, can be done quietly. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel the need to announce it to the world. Decisions that are truly settled don't demand witnesses. I moved carefully, not secretly, deliberately. I began by separating clarity from disclosure. Just because I knew what I was going to do didn't mean anyone else needed to know yet. Timing mattered. Not for control, but for coherence. I wanted my actions to reflect stability, not reaction. I consulted professionals quietly, asked questions neutrally, learned what my options actually were rather than what I had assumed they were. I gathered information the same way I always had, methodically, without drama. At home, nothing looked different. We talked about schedules, about logistics, about the vow renewal details that were now mostly symbolic to me. I remained kind. I remained engaged. I remained myself. That was the part no one expects. People imagine withdrawal as coldness, as bitterness, as visible distance. But I wasn't withdrawing from him emotionally. I had already done that months earlier. What I was withdrawing from now was an illusion. I stopped making long-term plans in my head that included him. I stopped narrating our future to myself as a single story. I began imagining my life as something I authored alone, and noticed how natural that felt. I made practical adjustments, updated personal documents, organized accounts, created space for autonomy without dismantling anything prematurely. Everything I did was reversible, except my resolve. And because nothing outward had shifted, no one questioned me. He spoke about after the renewal as if it were a reset button, a public recommitment that would magically reinforce everything underneath. I listened without correcting him. There was no cruelty in that silence. There was simply no benefit in explaining something he wasn't ready or required to understand yet. I wasn't trying to catch him off guard. I was trying to ensure that when the moment came, I wouldn't be negotiating from exhaustion or doubt. Moving in silence isn't about deception. It's about protecting clarity from being eroded by other people's reactions. I noticed how calm I felt. Not numb, not detached, calm in a grounded, steady way that I hadn't experienced in years. My energy wasn't being siphoned into managing expectations or soothing discomfort. It was being conserved. That conversation changed how I showed up everywhere else. I slept better. I focused more clearly. I felt less reactive. The background tension I had carried for so long began to fade. Not because circumstances had changed, but because I had stopped arguing with reality. The vow renewal approached. People commented on how composed I seemed, how at peace. They assumed it was happiness. I let them, not because I wanted to mislead anyone, but because I didn't owe the truth to anyone who wasn't living my life. Truth doesn't need an audience to be valid. I wasn't waiting for a sign. I wasn't hoping for a last-minute transformation. I was honoring a decision I had already made with care. And when you do that, you stop needing permission. Silence in this phase wasn't absence. It was precision. Consequences don't always announce themselves with disruption. Sometimes they arrive as absence, felt before they're understood. After the vow renewal, people remarked on how renewed we seemed. The photos were beautiful, the words were polished. From the outside, it looked like a reaffirmation, a solidifying of something that had already stood the test of time. From the inside, it marked the end of my participation in maintaining the illusion. I didn't change my tone. I didn't withdraw affection dramatically. I simply stopped overfunctioning. And that was enough to shift the balance. Small things began to slip. Plans that relied on my silent coordination became disorganized. Emotional moments that I used to preemptively manage went unbuffered. He started encountering friction in places where I had previously smoothed the way without acknowledgement. At first, he seemed confused. "Did we talk about this?" he'd ask, when something hadn't been arranged. "I don't think so," I'd reply, truthfully. I wasn't withholding. I just wasn't anticipating anymore. The difference between those two things is subtle, but profound. He felt the loss before he could name it. The absence of my invisible labor created gaps he wasn't accustomed to navigating. But because nothing had been taken from him explicitly, there was no clear place to direct frustration. That's when discomfort turns inward. He became slightly more irritable, slightly more restless. Not angry, just unsettled. The system wasn't running as smoothly, and he couldn't immediately identify why. Meanwhile, I felt steady. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just grounded. I had stopped performing a role that required constant self-adjustment. And without that performance, the relationship revealed its natural equilibrium, which leaned heavily in his favor. He began asking questions, not about me, but about logistics, about why things felt off, about why he felt more pressure. I answered plainly, without defensiveness, without explanation beyond what was asked. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I wasn't trying to provoke awareness. I was letting reality speak. And reality, when unfiltered, is persuasive. The more he felt the weight of shared responsibilities, the more apparent it became how unevenly they had been distributed. But awareness doesn't always arrive as accountability. Sometimes it arrives as resentment. That's when the tone shifted, not dramatically, just enough to signal discomfort. He missed the ease, the flow, the sense that things just worked. What he missed was me carrying more than my share without being seen. I watched this with a kind of detached compassion. Not because I felt superior, but because I recognized the pattern. I had lived inside it for years. The The consequences weren't punishment, they were exposed. Exposure of how much effort had been required to maintain the version of us that everyone admired. Exposure of how fragile that version was without my constant intervention. And still I didn't explain, because explanations, in this phase, would have turned clarity into negotiation. And I wasn't negotiating anymore. I was allowing the natural results of my absence from the role to unfold. Not loudly, not cruelly, just honestly. By the time he sensed something was truly wrong, the distance between us had already taken on a different quality. It wasn't the kind of distance that begs to be closed. It was the kind that exists because one person has already stepped out of the structure entirely. His concern didn't arrive as empathy at first. It arrived in confusion. "You don't seem like yourself lately," he said one evening. Not accusing, not gentle either, just unsettled. I considered that statement carefully before answering, because it was true in a way he couldn't yet understand. "I feel more like myself than I have in a long time," I said. That was the moment he realized this wasn't a mood. He started paying attention, but only after the absence became inconvenient. He noticed I wasn't reminding him of things, that I wasn't anticipating needs, that I wasn't cushioning disappointments. He interpreted this as withdrawal, as disengagement, as something that had happened to me rather than something I had chosen. That's when the questions began. Did I do something? Are you unhappy? Why didn't you say anything sooner? They came too late, not because the answers didn't exist, but because the questions were being asked from a place of panic rather than presence. I answered honestly, calmly, without accusation. I told him I had said things. Many times. Just not loudly. I told him that my silence had been mistaken for contentment, that I had adjusted myself for so long. It had become invisible. He listened. He nodded. He apologized, for the first time in a way that felt earnest. And still something didn't shift, because apologies don't undo structures, and awareness doesn't automatically create capacity for change. He wanted to fix it. I believe that. He suggested conversations, counseling, slowing down, reconnecting. All of it made sense. All of it came after I had already done the work of letting go. That's the part people don't talk about. By the time someone is ready to repair, the other person may already be finished repairing themselves. The energy required to re-enter the negotiation simply isn't there anymore. I wasn't angry. I wasn't closed off. I was complete. I had crossed the threshold where staying would require me to shrink again, and I wasn't willing to do that, even for reconciliation. He couldn't understand how I could be so calm. How could one speak with such certainty without bitterness? What he didn't realize was that my emotions had already been processed privately over the years. By the time they reached the surface, they were no longer raw, they were resolved. I told him that I didn't doubt his intentions, that I didn't question his character, that this wasn't about blame. It was about fit. And fit, once lost, can't always be restored by effort alone. The panic intensified when he realized I wasn't negotiating terms, I was stating a conclusion, that the window for incremental change had closed quietly, without an announcement. He felt blindsided. I felt aligned. That asymmetry is painful, but it's also honest, because timing matters. And sometimes, realization arrives after the moment when it could have changed the outcome. That doesn't make it meaningless. It just makes it too late. When we finally sat down to talk, not in passing, not in fragments, but deliberately, it didn't feel like a confrontation in the way people imagine them. There was no raised voice, no emotional escalation, no need to prove who was right. It felt like closure happening in real time. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the same table where I had once stayed up late, piecing together the clarity that led me here. The symmetry of that wasn't lost on me. He spoke first, carefully. He told me he felt shut out, that he didn't recognize the distance until it was already there, that he wished I had been more explicit, more direct. I listened without interrupting, not because I was deferring, but because I wanted him to feel fully heard. I had learned the value of that, even if he was only learning it now. When it was my turn, I didn't list grievances. I didn't replay old moments. I didn't argue timelines. I spoke about patterns. I told him that I had spent years adjusting my needs downward to maintain harmony, that I had been praised for being easy to live with while slowly disappearing inside that ease, that I had asked for connection in quiet ways that were easy to overlook, and that I had stopped asking when I realized asking wouldn't change the structure. He tried to interrupt me once, out of habit. He caught himself and stopped. That mattered. Just not in the way it might have earlier. I told him that my silence hadn't been an absence of feeling. It had been the presence of understanding. That by the time he noticed the distance, I had already done the work of accepting what our marriage required of me to continue, and that I was no longer willing to pay that price. He asked me if there was anything he could do now. I considered the question carefully, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to respond with integrity rather than finality. I told him the truth. If I stayed, I said, I would eventually resent you, not because you're unkind, but because I would be choosing to abandon myself again. And I don't want either of us to live with that. There was silence after that. Not the tense kind, the acknowledging kind. He nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition. We talked about logistics, about next steps, about how to move forward with dignity. The conversation remained grounded, even gentle. What surprised him most was my steadiness. What surprised me most was how right it felt. This wasn't a victory. It wasn't a defeat. It was the end of a dynamic that had run its course. Confrontation without heat doesn't mean absence of pain. It means the presence of clarity. And clarity has a way of lowering voices naturally. I didn't need him to fully understand my internal process. I needed him to respect my conclusion. And he did. Not because he suddenly became someone else, but because, finally, there was nothing left for me to explain. After the separation, people expected me to unravel. They expected grief to make me smaller, louder, sharper, something visibly altered. They expected bitterness, or at least a story with clear villains and victims. When that didn't happen, they didn't know how to place me. And that was the first sign that I had changed. I wasn't lighter in the way people imagine freedom to be. I wasn't euphoric. I was solid. My days felt quieter, but not emptier. The absence I noticed most was the absence of self-editing. I didn't rehearse conversations before having them. I didn't anticipate emotional fallout that wasn't mine to manage. I didn't adjust my tone to be more palatable. I spoke plainly. I paused when I needed to think. I let silence exist without rushing to fill it. And the world adjusted. Some people leaned in. They asked better questions. They met me with curiosity rather than assumption. Others drifted, not dramatically, just naturally. Without my constant emotional availability, there was less for them to take. That didn't feel like a loss. It felt like alignment. I began to recognize myself again. Not the version of me that had been praised for being easy, but the version that had always been there underneath. Observant, principled, calm by choice, not obligation. My sense of worth no longer came from how smoothly things ran around me. It came from coherence, between what I valued and how I lived. I learned that I don't need to be loud to be present, that boundaries don't require announcements, that walking away with dignity is not the same as giving up. The marriage didn't fail because love vanished. It ended because the structure depended on my silence, and silence, once chosen consciously, stops being consent. I don't carry anger toward him. I don't narrate the past as a tragedy. It was a chapter that taught me the cost of being endlessly adaptable and the value of being anchored. Now, when I enter relationships of any kind, I pay attention to balance early. I notice who adjusts and who assumes, who listens and who fills space. And I no longer confuse peace with self-erasure. Who I am now is not someone new. I'm simply no longer hiding the parts of myself that don't fit other people's expectations. And that has changed everything. There's a particular kind of story people like to hear at the end of a marriage. A story with a clear turning point, a moment of betrayal or explosion that explains everything cleanly. Those stories are easier to digest. They allow us to assign blame, take sides, and move on. But most endings aren't like that. Most endings are quiet. They arrive after years of small compromises that don't look like sacrifices until you add them up. They happen when one person finally stops negotiating with themselves about what they're allowed to need. If there's a moral here, it isn't leave sooner or try harder or never be patient. It's simpler and harder than that. Appearances can't hold a marriage together. Photos can't. Traditions can't. Public vows can't. And neither can being endlessly understanding at your own expense. What holds a relationship together is mutual presence. Not just being there, but being seen. Not just harmony, but shared authorship of the life you're building. When one person becomes the quiet infrastructure that keeps everything functioning, love starts to look like efficiency instead of connection. And efficiency is a poor substitute for intimacy. I don't regret being patient. I don't regret loving fully. I don't even regret the silence because it taught me something essential. That silence given freely is generosity, but silence given out of self-erasure is a debt that eventually comes due. The vow renewal didn't break my marriage, it revealed it. Standing there, repeating words we both meant in different ways, I finally understood that recommitment without recalibration is just repetition. And repetition doesn't repair imbalance, it reinforces it. Walking away wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of alignment. I share this not to warn you against commitment, but to invite you into a deeper kind of honesty, with yourself first. Pay attention to who you are when you're trying to keep the peace. Notice what you minimize, what you carry, what you quietly absorb. Ask yourself whether your calm is coming from strength or from adaptation that's gone unacknowledged. Because you don't need a dramatic reason to choose yourself. You just need clarity. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt valued for your usefulness more than your presence, I'd really like to hear from you. What's one quiet compromise you made that you didn't realize was changing you at the time?